So in this lesson, we're going to go over a different form of trade policy, and specifically we're going to talk about quotas. Okay, so before we've talked about tariffs and how they affect international trade patterns. And today what we're going to talk about are quotas. Now a quota is a legal limit on the number of imports. And recall that a tariff is a tax on imports. Okay, so most trade policy has to do with imports, and it's either going to take the form of a tariff, which is a tax, or it's going to take the place of a quota, which is a limit. Okay, and what we're going to do today specifically is we're going to focus on trade policy in developing countries. All right, now these countries tend to be much smaller economies relative to developed countries. Okay, and we saw what happens when you place a tariff on a good when you're a small economy, right? It tends to have the effect of making your country poorer because your citizens or the domestic consumers end up paying a greater share of the incidence of the tariff than the foreign producers do. And as a result, those deadweight loss triangles are much bigger than the additional tax revenue received from foreign producers. And so what developing countries tend to use instead of a tariff is a quota, okay? And so we'll go through some of these things, just so we can talk about what's going on, okay? Now, I started off the class with an acknowledgement that a lot of economists, and this is true across the political spectrum, are concerned with excuse me, the welfare of all people. And a lot of economists particularly focus on the welfare of developing countries, right? And one thing that we want to do is help these countries develop so that everyone there can live, healthily and wealthily, right? However they choose to define, these terms. We want people to have options and have access to things that they want to have access to, okay? So the motivating puzzles for this class are things like, why do some people, die of starvation and others die of obesity, right? It seems like, if we have, a very round individual who looks like this, all right? You can see my excellent drawing skills. And then we have someone else who is literally a stick figure, which is something I feel much more comfortable drawing. All right, if we have a round individual, and this is meant to be fat and not muscle, right? If we have a rather rotund or portly individual who is dying because they're too, overweight, and we have this person over here who's dying because they're malnourished, it seems like we could take calories and somehow transfer them from this person or this society that promotes, gluttony, or not gluttony, but perhaps gluttony, that promotes, overeating, and then send it to this other country that doesn't have access to as many calories, and everybody would win, right? This seems like it'd be a win-win. The overweight society would lose weight and they would live longer and healthier, and the underweight society would gain weight and they would live longer and healthier. And so that seems like a fairly simple thing that we could do. Alternatively, clean water, right? In some parts of the world, getting access to, even somewhat clean water is very difficult. It could take, walking miles and carrying it on your back, right? And in doing so, that limits how much water you can carry, right? And how often you can go there, because when you're walking to get the water, you're not actually producing anything. You're just going to get water, right? In other parts of the world, such as the United States, clean water is so readily available that I bet no one has ever even thought about where their next cup of clean water will come from. In fact, clean water is so relatively available that we even put it in our toilets, right? That's an absurd thing. If you told someone in, a developing country that we used clean water in our toilets, they would be, aghast. I mean, how dare we, waste perfectly clean water by putting it in the toilet and flushing it, right? It's a ridiculous thing. Or, think about, access to $1 vaccines, right? A lot of vaccines that save lives and prevent, serious illnesses cost $1 or even less, right? And so why is it that there are people around the world that are suffering from this? I have in my coffee cup here, right? I have probably close to $3, right? What's stopping this money from getting from me to somewhere else in the world where it could save people's lives? What's preventing that from happening, right? And I'll give you a hint, it's not greed on my part. I would gladly mail this money to someone else in the world if it would help them live for another day, or even if it helps them not die of a very curable disease, okay? So these are the motivating puzzles here. It's like, why is there basically poverty amidst plenty, right? We live in a very wealthy world. The world today is wealthier than it has ever been. Why are there still people that are so dirt poor that they're dying from things like starvation or lack of access to water or lack of access to medicine? It's a somewhat, it's a terrible thing, and it's something that a lot of economists spend a lot of time thinking about and trying to resolve. Okay, so we think about these things not because they're curious mathematical puzzles, but because they have real world implications for life and death. They're very, very important. Okay, so the basic idea of trade policy since World War II, so trade policy since World War II in developing countries has been has been to promote manufacturing. Okay, and if you think about it, every wealthy society has a strong manufacturing sector, right? Wages in factories tend to be much higher than wages on farms. Okay, so you get higher wages. The productivity does not depend on the weather. So if it's raining out, you can still go work inside the factory. And if it's raining on a farm, it might be difficult or impossible to actually till that land. Okay. And so the idea is that having a manufacturing base or having a manufacturing sector is wildly beneficial to the workers and to the citizens. Okay. And so to do this, a lot of developing countries use what's called import substitution, right? The idea that we need to limit the number of imports of imported manufactured goods that come into the country. And the idea is that by doing so, domestic consumers buy domestically produced manufactured goods. Right? And the most common way to do this in developing countries is to use a quota. Okay? And so what a quota will do, so think of it, think of the quota as being compared to the tariff again, right? Where a tariff was a tax on imports, a quota is a legal limit on the number of imports. Okay, so if we impose a quota, that means that only a certain number of imported goods are allowed to come into the country. Okay, and so what we do, okay, so a tariff, if you want to compare and contrast them again, a tariff reduces imports by raising their price, right, relative to domestically produced goods. Okay, and a quota reduces imports by limiting them. Right, and the secondary effect is to raise domestic prices. Okay, so if you want to think of it this way, a tariff is designed to raise tax revenue, and the secondary effect is that it reduces imports. Okay, a quota is designed to reduce imports by literally limiting them, and the secondary effect is that the domestic prices rise. Okay, so let's draw a quota graph. Okay, and I'm going to put in some hypothetical numbers here just for illustrative purposes. And let's say we have a world price of $10. All right, and this is the world price. And at that world price, consumers want to buy, let's say, 400 units of this thing, and there will be 100 units produced domestically. Okay, and let's say we impose a quota of 100, okay, which says that once we've imported 100 units of this good, no more imports can happen. Okay, so if that happens, then what we've got is a situation, and here, so notice that here imports equal 300. Okay, and if we impose a quota of 100, what that's going to do is it's going to shrink this horizontal distance, but it's going to raise the price up here. So now we might end up with a situation where, as a result of the quota, right, so a quota is mandating that this horizontal distance equals 100. Okay, so let's say this drops down to 300, and this drops down to 200. Okay, so now the imports are 100, but the secondary effect is that the price is going to go up. Okay, and so what happens is that a quota limits the number of imports, but it ends up raising the domestic price. Okay? And so what we have is a situation that's very, very similar to a tariff. It looks almost identical. If I change this to PT, we'd have the exact same effect. Okay? But here, so remember we had, consumer surpluses and producer surpluses and deadweight losses. So this triangle here is again deadweight loss, as is this one. Okay? But this right here is no longer going to be tax revenue because there isn't a tax. What it is instead is additional profits earned by foreign producers who import goods. Okay. Now there will be, fewer imports. So there were 200 less imports as a result of this quota. Because remember, there were 300 and now there's only 100, which means imports have decreased by 200. Okay. So some of the foreign producers are not going to be able to import their goods. So it's not additional profits to all foreign producers. It's only additional profits to the foreign producers who still import the goods. Okay. And so the argument that developing countries will use is the same as before. They'll use the infant industry argument. To justify this. Okay. And the argument again is basically that the country will eventually have a comparative advantage if that industry is allowed to grow. Okay. Now there are a few problems with this. Okay, so we highlighted a couple of them in the last video, but I'm going to highlight a couple more, right, as well. So problems. The first one is the same as before. The infant might not grow up. Okay, same argument as before. The infant might not grow up, and they might, or they might even just misreveal. Okay. The second one is the one I want to focus, or the second and third ones are the ones that we want to focus on today. The second is that timing is important. Right? A country's comparative advantage isn't something that you simply develop and you grow and you pick and choose. It's something that you must discover. Okay? So there's little sense in actively trying to grow a comparative advantage in something if you don't currently have one in that industry. Right? So think about, what if the United States were to try to develop a comparative advantage in producing cars in the year 1800, right? That wouldn't make sense at all because cars didn't exist, right? And it was even before the Industrial Revolution. So lots of things about that wouldn't make any sense at all, right? But today, we have a comparative advantage in making cars. We export plenty of them. Okay. And so what happened over time is we discovered that we were good at producing cars and we produced cars. We didn't choose to be good at cars. We discovered that we were good at them. Okay. And that's a thing that you have to discover on your own. Every country is going to have a comparative advantage in something, but to try to actively pick it and to choose it, ex ante or before the fact can very easily lead to serious problems. If Antarctica decided to have a comparative advantage in growing corn, they'd find out that that wasn't such a great idea. Corn doesn't really grow in the freezing tundra, okay? And the third one that we want to that I want to present to you is that there may be, or the bad, let's say, the bad may be masked by other responses. Okay? So let's say that if we protect the car industry, so we protect the car industry, right? That can very easily and is likely to be deleterious or growth inhibiting. Okay, if we protect the car industry, what might happen is the steel industry might grow artificially large in its efforts to support the car industry. So the domestic car industry will likely be buying steel. Domestic steel is geographically closer than foreign steel. And so it, it could be the case, excuse me, that the domestic steel industry grows artificially larger than it ought to be. Okay? And that represents wasted resources, resources that are not going to their highest valued use. They're instead going to this artificially high valued use. Okay? And the removal of protections from the car industry would then have, so correcting the problems of protecting the car industry would have spillover effects on the steel industry as well, compounding the problem. Okay, but in reality, it's just it's making a bigger problem out of an existing problem, and it's making the sting of the reallocation that much more costly. Okay, now regardless of these critiques, starting in about 1945, so let's say 1945 onward to 1985, many countries engaged in this import substitution policy or policies. Okay. And so, the goal again is to substitute domestic production for foreign production. And the idea is that by doing that, we'll grow the local economy and everyone there will be made better off. Okay. Now, let's think about whether or not that worked. So here's the question. Are there still poor countries in the world? And the answer is yes. Okay. So it turns out that by speeding up economic development, or by attempting to speed up economic development, it didn't actually work out very well. In fact, a lot of people argue that it leads to massive corruption within these developing countries. And in several cases, it's even led to increasing economic inequality. Okay. And a big problem, or the big problem with this, is that the reason why these industries don't exist in developing countries in the first place is because of a lack of underlying factors. Okay. So to have manufacturing, you need several things. Okay. So what you're going to need are things like infrastructure. You're going to need roads and bridges and all sorts of other things that help you get the product around the country. Making things is one thing, but actually getting them to market is a separate question entirely. So you need roads, you need gas stations, you need trucks that actually run well. You need lots of things to move things around the country. You're going to need a reliable electrical grid. Right? Without this, without a reliable electrical grid, you're going to have a very hard time actually producing the goods. Okay? You're also in terms of, so this is in terms of physical capital or physical resources. And this is just two things, or a small subset. So we can put, etc., to indicate that there's more to this than just these two things. But you're also going to need skilled labor, and you're going to need entrepreneurs, and you're going to need managerial competence. Okay, so these are the physical things that you need, right? So these are physical demands or needs or requirements, and these are more human capital, right? Now, I want to point out that we're using the phrase skilled labor or managerial competence, right, in this instance. This is not to say that developing countries have I'm going to use the word stupid, right? They don't have stupid people. Okay? The people in developing countries are definitely not stupid, all right? And it's not saying that they're lazy. Okay? So they're not stupid and lazy. They're not ignorant, right? They just don't have any experience doing this. So just like I have no experience running a business, so I have very low managerial competence. It doesn't mean that I'm stupid. There's lots of things that I can do as well. Okay, I don't have the ability to take apart an engine and put it back together, but several people in developing countries can do that very easily, right? So these are particular skills that are lacked, and this is a particular knowledge that people lack, right? In the US, I mean, we are wealthy enough that we can send our kids or our children to school, from kindergarten all the way through high school. So that's 13, maybe 14 years, right? 13 or 14 years of education, plus another 4 for college. That's, 17 to 18 years of literally just sitting in a room and listening to people like me teach you things, right? Other countries aren't wealthy enough to afford that. It doesn't mean that you are more intelligent or you're more competent than they are. It just means that you have the ability to gain experience and learn techniques from people who have been there before. If you didn't have access to that, you wouldn't be stupid. You just wouldn't have, the same training that you do. Okay? So this is not saying that people are stupid or lazy in other parts of the world. It's saying that they lack the training or the ability or the training and expertise that you are able to develop by going to school. Okay? So there could be a lack of underlying factors. That might be part of the problem for why countries aren't developing enough. Alternatively, it could be the case that trade policies. So the another explanation for why growth from 1945 to 1985 didn't occur is that trade policies were convoluted or otherwise confusing. Okay, so if a trade policy is more convoluted than a simple tariff or a quota. So if you think back a couple of videos ago, I showed you the number of pages in the Federal Registry for the Code of Regulations was over 170,000, right? Think about if you had to follow a bunch of ridiculous rules, or let's say just rules, not necessarily ridiculous, but let's say there were lots of rules that were very complicated, and for you to figure out how to follow them was extremely difficult. It might be the case that it's too difficult or too expensive for you to figure out how to operate, and so you just simply don't. Okay, so there could be overlapping, contradictory, or otherwise confusing policies to try to accomplish, development goals that make the paperwork associated with doing business entirely too tedious to be worth the person's effort. Okay, now, so since 1985, another sheet. So since 1985, developing countries have reduced their tariffs and quotas. Right? Essentially, they've opened their borders much more to trade. Okay. Now, this is not an argument that says that they should open them completely or anything. So remember, there may be an optimal tariff or quota rate. Okay, so we're not making that argument. Okay, but what's happened is tariff rates have fallen, quota rates have fallen. Okay, so the most striking example of this that I was able to find is to look at India. In 1985, their tariff rate was close to 100%. Okay, and today it's about 10%. Okay, so they've reduced their quota or their tariff rate significantly, right, by 90%. And as a result, India today is far wealthier than it has ever been. Okay, so there's lots of explanations for why having too restrictive of a trade policy leads to less growth or even negative growth, and then releasing those protections or opening borders to foreign trade and foreign production can actually lead to massive economic growth. Okay, and the argument there is that basically by allowing countries to specialize and benefit from other people's comparative advantage, other people, the domestic citizens can be made far, far wealthier.